Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Spiritist Talk series promoted by the U.S. Spiritist Federation on Saturday mornings at 11 a.m. East Coast time. The U.S. Spiritist Federation is committed to presenting Spiritism to the American public. Please support our efforts with a donation at www.spiritist.us. Thank you. Today, we'll have our special guest, Edward Christie, whose topic is Blessed Are the Afflicted, Beethoven's Suffering. And now, hi, Edward. How are you doing?
Hi, Peter. Thank you.
Great. Before Edward shares his knowledge with us, please let me introduce him more formally. Edward Christie has been involved with Spiritism for more than 20 years and is an active member of the Inner Enlightenment Spiritist Society in New York City. Edward is a classically trained pianist, has taught music in New York City schools, as well as computer science courses at New York University, NYU. He enjoys learning and uses his love of teaching to share what he has learned with others. Thank you for being here, Edward.
Thank you for inviting me.
Certainly. Remember, everyone, to please send in your questions because we will be open for questions and answers after his talk. Edward, it's all yours.
Okay. I want to thank everyone who's joining today. A reminder, this is the last day of winter. Tomorrow begins spring. So this is an appropriate topic because suffering is kind of a wintry experience and spring brings new growth and creativity. So this talk happened just at the right time. Okay. So I recently heard someone say, if you're feeling really good about life, don't worry, it'll pass. You might not want to hear what I have to tell you. Everyone who lives will suffer. Each of us suffers in his or her own way. Some seem to handle suffering gracefully and others rebel against it. It doesn't matter whether we've lived a charmed life or a poor one, whether we enjoy material riches or a life of want. No one escapes suffering. Naturally, this is news we don't want to be reminded of. We'll change the channel, close the book, switch to another video rather than call this to mind. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, we read, it's difficult to understand the convenience of suffering in order to be happy. Wait, what was that? Suffering can make us happy? Suffering is a convenience? No wonder this is difficult to understand. But Jesus comes to our aid. He made us a promise. He said, blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God belongs to you. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. We weep because we lost a loved one, a job, our friend, our youth, our social position, or our health. No one can avoid all these troubles. Yet we're tempted to think that suffering happens if we're not careful, or it only happens to an unfortunate few, or that we can avoid suffering if we're good or smart or lucky. We'd like to believe that suffering is optional, something we don't have to go through. And when despite all our efforts and all our wishes, we suffer anyway, we can look to drown out the pain with distractions and addictions, or become desperate when we don't see an end to suffering, or our heart breaks from a loss and we can't find comfort anywhere. The Buddha's first noble truth is that suffering is an inborn characteristic of human existence. He said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. We push back against this truth and say, we're made to be happy in this life, only to find that each happiness has an expiration date, because no joy can be sustained indefinitely. Our life settles into a peaceful period and we think that suffering's behind us, but then some event comes along and our suffering begins again. Joannes Evangelist says, the trials that everyone must go through are of high moral and spiritual significance. At first glance, suffering and achieving appear to be opposites. Suffering preoccupies us. It screams for relief so loudly that we can't focus on doing anything valuable. And yet these two forces, suffering and achieving, are inseparable. None of us are completely happy with the way life is. We reach one goal and another takes its place. We have a sense that our life is incomplete, that there's always something lacking. We're looking for a better life than the one we're living. We're on a search for something we don't have, for a change that'll bring us what we're missing. We swing between suffering because we want what we don't have and suffering because we can't keep what we want. But suffering can push us to achieve. When we suffer, we look for ways to soften the bitter feelings we have. And this search gives us a chance to examine ourselves and to relieve our suffering by changing our life from bitter to better. Change is a loss that causes us to suffer, and change is a gain that moves us closer to fulfill our life, our desire for a new life. So, how do we deal with suffering? There are some common patterns of behavior we use to cope with suffering. Let's look at 3 of these patterns because they all have something in common. They're good, they're reasonable, and they help to diminish the pain of suffering. The first pattern is to get as far away as we can from what makes us suffer. We move out, divorce, split up, leave, quit, never see the person again, never go back to that place. Second pattern is to master suffering, to overpower it. We make resolutions, break a habit, control ourselves with willpower, get the upper hand over our hurt, and beat suffering. The third pattern is to use a method or a practice that reduces suffering, a technique that redirects our thoughts and actions. We join a support group, a therapy, a spiritual community, exercise, listen to motivational speakers, and go on retreat. These behavioral patterns are powerful because they're useful and they work. With them, we find that when we suffer, we're not helpless. We can use our will and our intelligence to alleviate our suffering. When we leave, we begin to mature. That's the reason most of us move from our parents' home or change jobs. When we gain mastery, we deepen our understanding of ourselves or some subject. We turn what we're missing into something we have a degree of power over. And when we cultivate a method, we bring ourselves to higher states of consciousness and make sense of our lives. Leaving, mastering, and using methods. 3 good, reasonable, and useful ways to lighten our suffering. Now, to bring these patterns to life, I want to tell you a story. The story of a man, his life and his suffering, and how he turned his sorrow into success and misery into beauty. His name, Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven's suffering was unique, but not uncommon. We can empathize with his suffering and think about how he used it to achieve something great. The path he took to achieve was not a straight one. As a child, he suffered abuse from his father, and left home as soon as he could. As a young adult, his hearing began to fail, and he overcame his poor health by turning himself into a hero who could master suffering. In his middle age, his heart was broken in love, and he found the musical method to pull himself out of a deep depression. And near the end of his life, he found a way to endure all these trials that was more powerful than any of these methods. And this was the way that Jesus taught him to cope with suffering, to forgive. To understand his life, we have to get to know something about the man. I want to keep us from idolizing him as Beethoven, the great composer. In his life, he used 3 names: the German Ludwig, the Italian Luigi, and the French Louis. To me, Louis sounds the most down to earth. So for the purposes of this talk, I'll call him by that name. Louis grew up hard and fast. By the time he was 5, his musical talents were apparent, and his first teacher was right in his own home, his father, Johann. Johann was a court musician who gave keyboard and voice lessons to the local nobility and the wealthy. Johann recognized his son's talent, and he tried to make him into another child prodigy like Mozart. His teaching method was brutal and cruel. One observer said he saw little Louis van Beethoven in the house, standing in front of the piano and weeping. Johann drank hard. He'd come home late at night after drinking and then roughly shake Louis awake and make him practice piano until morning. A childhood companion of Louis said, Beethoven's father used violence when it came to making him start his musical studies, and there were few days when he wasn't beaten in order to compel him to sit at the piano. Johann's beatings didn't turn his son into another Mozart, but he did succeed in making Louis hate him. At school, he was remembered as being isolated and neglected. He wrote to a friend that he enjoyed only a few happy hours and was often deeply sad. He grew up an angry and lonely child, and music was his outlet. As a young teen, he found a good teacher and got a job playing music with the electoral court. His mother, Maria, shared in his sadness. She was unhappy in her marriage, complaining about her husband's drinking debts and her lonely home life. She advised the neighbor to stay single, adding, "What is marriage? A little joy, but then a chain of sorrows." She died when Louis was 16 years old. By this time, Johann's drinking was so heavy that he could no longer hold a job. So his mother's death made Louis the legal head of his household, forcing him at a young age into an adult role. He had to provide for his 2 younger brothers and their unemployed alcoholic father. Louis felt the burden of both his father's illness and his obligations as head of a family, and he realized that his musical talent was his ticket out of his oppressive life. So when he was 22, he packed his bags and moved from his hometown of Bonn in Germany to Vienna, the center of the music and entertainment world. He made Vienna his new home for the rest of his life and never once returned to his hometown. Now, when Louis left home, it was a perfectly natural response, an entirely human defense against suffering. Moving away from what makes us suffer seems such a reasonable thing to do that it's hard to fault Louis for making this decision. And it seemed to work. But we're still left with the question, did running away from suffering cure the source of his pain? Well, yes and no. Running away gave him some immediate relief and created a distance between him and suffering. It reduced the weight of suffering and gave him some perspective on it. But the effect of his father's abusive treatment of him didn't disappear when he moved out. Throughout his life, he rebelled against anyone in a position of authority with the same intensity with which he resented his father's cruelty. And he even created a fantasy that he was not Johann's son, but rather the illegitimate child of the King of Prussia. And he insisted that this was true until the end of his life. It was another source of suffering that the man Louis called his father was a second-rate musician and drunkard. Louis left his family, and that helped, but leaving didn't heal his suffering. When he moved to Vienna, it was a city of pianists. Louis quickly made a name for himself as a virtuoso pianist, and his original compositions were gaining respect. He was appreciated by the public, wrote a lot of music, and was earning money from patrons, concerts, teaching, and composition. And this outward picture of success continued for nearly 10 years. But if we look more closely at the picture, we see trouble. Louis was beginning to lose his hearing. Imagine what it meant for him, a musician, to be faced with a future that was silent, to have failing ability in the one sense that ought to be more perfect in him than in others. He wrote to a friend, "I live a miserable life. For almost 2 years, I have ceased to attend any social function just because I felt it impossible to say to people, I am deaf." And by the age of 32, his hearing crisis had reached a point where he considered taking his own life. Louis's hearing was failing. He was isolated from society and battling his impulse to suicide. How would any of us deal with a despair this deep? To have a disability that threatened his ability to practice his art, the one thing above all else that he was devoted to. Louis was faced with terrible emotional stresses, and instead of sinking into a deep depression, he turned his suffering into victory. He poured his isolation, his passion, and his rage into his music. He wrote, "I live entirely in my music, and hardly have I completed one composition that I've already begun another. At my present rate of composing, I often produce 3 or 4 works at the same time." Through his music, Louis showed himself and the world that he was the master of his own fate, and that his poor hearing would never stop him from composing. And he wasn't isolated socially, really. Instead, he was admired. One friend wrote, "For all his odd ways, which often bordered on the offensive, there was something so inexpressibly touching and noble in him that one could not but esteem him and feel drawn to him." Louis enjoyed a reputation as a great composer, and his music was widely published and performed, and he was gaining fame not only in Vienna, but also in Germany and England as well. His invention of himself as a hero conquering his suffering was a natural defense against his fear of failing as a musician and being isolated from society. As much as these were real to him, the fear he felt and the isolation he perceived were largely his own invention. Louis was a popular composer and had many patrons willing to pay him to write music. And people didn't like him any less once they learned he was deaf. In fact, there's little evidence that people cared about his hearing loss or treated him any differently once they knew. If anything, friends and patrons responded with compassion and understanding. Louis was admired as a musician and loved as a person, despite his fear of failure and rejection. But we're still left with the question, did mastering suffering cure the source of his pain? Well, yes and no. Louis's image of himself as a hero towering above his suffering pulled him out of a low point of his life. By constructing a musical persona of a hero mastering his fate, he reached a creative high point and produced one great work after another. But while this heroic period lasted for some 8 years, during which he composed some of his best-known music, trouble was never far away. The kind of trouble that heroic music just couldn't conquer. Louis treasured his friendships, but he hungered for a woman's love. He wanted to settle down and marry and raise a family. Now, Louis was often in love, but he fell in love with unattainable women. He fell in love with engaged women. He fell in love with married women. He fell in love with aristocratic women. He fell in love with beautiful women. Louis was a short, dark, eccentric man with a pockmarked face and an accent and manners of someone who came from the hills. One biographer writes, "He was wholly lacking in physical grace. His movements were awkward and clumsy, and he constantly overturned or broke things and tended to spill his inkwell into the piano." And a friend wrote that he was as a beggar. He was so dirty in his dress and in his manner, like a bear, sulky and contrary. He laughed like no one else. It was a scream. He would call people names as he passed them on the street. He was greedy and always mistrustful. And now, how's that for a dating profile? Women may have loved Louis the pianist and Louis the composer, but not Louis the man. But when he was 42, it finally happened. He found love with a woman he called his immortal beloved. Her name was Antony Brentano, an aristocratic married mother of 4. She offered to leave her husband and her children and live with Louis. He was starved for a woman's affection, and for one moment, he had within his reach a woman's unreserved love. Yet he admitted to himself that he couldn't live the kind of life Antony offered to him, to be a husband and a father. He couldn't make peace between his desire to marry and his dedication to music. So he broke off the affair suddenly and fell into a deep depression. He wrote in his diary, "You must not be a human being, not for yourself, but only for others. For you, there is no longer any happiness except within yourself and your art. Oh God, give me the strength to conquer myself. Nothing must chain me to life." Thus, everything connected with Antony will go to ruin. His health deteriorated, and he couldn't compose. He was on the edge of a nervous breakdown and given to suicidal thoughts. Louis dominated the urge to take his own life because as he was growing up, he learned some valuable lessons. He wrote, "If I had not read somewhere that a man may not voluntarily part with his life so long as a good deed remained for him to perform, I should long ago have been no more, and indeed, by my own hand." Louis found strength in this teaching because he took the time to learn it before his body was full of pain and his mind jammed with dark thoughts. He told friends he was educated in Proverbs and wrote that Socrates and Jesus were my models. He learned the lesson these two teachers taught him before he knew completely what they meant or when he would need them. Their teachings lived deep within him, and he could draw on them when his heart was troubled and suffering seemed to have no end. A little bit of history here. Louis lived during the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution's principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity turned into French wars of conquest called the Napoleonic Wars. Austria suffered many losses at the hand of Napoleon's army during these wars, and Vienna, Beethoven's adopted city, was even occupied for a time by the French. After a seemingly endless string of victorious battles, Napoleon started to suffer defeat after defeat until the wars came to an end and Austria was once again a free country. At this moment, with his affair with Antony over, Louis was in poor mental and physical health. One observer mentioned seeing him at an inn in a distant corner at a table which, though large, was avoided by the other guests due to the very uninviting habits into which he had fallen. He had grown so negligent of his person as to appear there sometimes positively dirty. One day during this dark period, a businessman named Johann Malzer convinced Louis to write a piece of music to commemorate Austria's freedom from Napoleon in France. Nearly overnight, he composed an orchestral work filled with drums, and trumpets, and noisemakers, a battle scene in music, and called it Wellington's Victory. The work created a sensation. Today, we'd say it went viral. A notice in a local newspaper said that the applause rose to the point of ecstasy. The music made Louis more famous than he had ever been, and he was now making more money than ever before. Overjoyed with the popularity of Wellington's Victory, Louis found a musical formula for wealth and fame. Over the next few months, he composed a number of vocal and choral works based on current events, works such as You Wise Founders of Happy Nations and The Glorious Moment, works that also celebrated the country's freedom from Napoleon. Of this music, one biographer writes, "These works, filled with bombastic rhetoric and patriotic excesses, marked the nadir of Beethoven's artistic career. In them, his heroic style is revived, but his parody and farce. The heroic style, forged in doubt, rebellion and defiance had ended in conformity. Louis found a recipe, a musical formula for creating popular works, and it gave him a sense of achievement. Usually, Louis resketched and revised his work, and this took time, but these works were written rapidly, cashing in on the excitement that current events created. Using a formula that worked was a natural defense against suffering. Who could blame him for taking advantage of a method for composing works that not only lifted his spirits, but also brought him fame and wealth? So we're left with the question, did using a compositional method for writing music cure the source of his pain? Well, yes and no. Louis wrote popular works that raised him out of his sorrow and brought him fame and money. So in this way, writing these works had a positive effect. And after breaking off his affair with Antony, Louis had reached a low point in his life and he needed something so he could pick himself up and begin to live again. These mock heroic works fueled his creative imagination and gave his life meaning again. But they were works of the moment, a light that burned brightly for a little while and then went out. He wrote them using a method that worked for a time, but this music was pushed to the side once the events that inspired them were past. These new works made him a celebrity, but they had no lasting value because they were music of the moment. While the moment lasted, the music had value. But once the moment passed, the music was forgotten. A few months after Louis' rise to popular fame, his star faded. The public had no more use for Louis' second-rate heroic music, and they forgot about him. Louis had two younger brothers, Caspar Karl and Nicholas. Caspar Karl was the older of the two, and he was married to a woman named Johanna. Together, they had a son named Karl, the only child of any of the three Beethoven brothers. Caspar Karl died of tuberculosis shortly after the incidents in Louis' life we just examined. In his will, he wrote, Caspar Karl wrote, "Along with my wife, I appoint my brother Ludwig van Beethoven co-guardian." Instead of obeying his brother's wishes, Louis got it into his head that he had the right to take his 9-year-old nephew away from his mother and raise him as his own son. Louis claimed that Karl's mother lacked the moral and intellectual qualities needed to raise him properly, and that he, Ludwig, was the boy's true guardian. Louis took his argument to court, and because he was the famous Louis van Beethoven, he won. He wrote, "I have fought a battle for the purpose of wresting a poor, unhappy child from the clutches of his unworthy mother, and I have won the day." The court took Karl away from his mother 3 months after his father's death. Louis put Karl in a boarding school, and Johanna was allowed only supervised visits with her son. Louis was Karl's sole guardian for over 3 years until the court reversed its decision and took Karl away from him and returned him to his mother's care. We can only guess at why Louis would take his nephew away from his mother, but one thing is clear. His interference in his brother's family brought great suffering to Karl, Johanna, and himself. Taking Karl away from his mother didn't give Louis the family he wanted. Karl loved Louis, but he also loved his mother. Karl's father was dead, and when Louis took him away from his mother, instead of making Karl his surrogate son, he made him an orphan. In fact, that's what Louis called him, a poor orphan. When he was 20 years old, Karl bought 2 pistols and used them to attempt suicide. He recovered from the gunshot wound, and when the police asked him why he tried to commit suicide, he said that Louis tormented him too much, and that I grew worse because my uncle wanted me to be better. Karl was, in his own words, tired of imprisonment and needed to find a way to get free from his uncle. His suicide attempt was his way to reject Louis as his father. Louis wrote, "All my hopes have vanished. All my hopes of having near me someone who would resemble me, at least in my better qualities." In his final years, Louis faced some painful truths, and his illusions were being wiped out one by one. His hearing was never going to improve, and he could no longer perform in public. His hope to marry and have a family was over. He couldn't be guaranteed success by writing compositions that relied on a musical formula. The patrons who had been supporting him financially had either died or lost their fortunes. And during the court case over Carl's custody, it was proven that he was not the illegitimate son of a king, but rather the son of Johann von Beethoven, the second-rate musician and unemployed drunk, the man who raised him and beat him and taught him music, the man he both loved and despised. Now he wanted to return to his birthplace and visit the graves of his parents. And although he never did return to his hometown, this desire shows that he was willing to make peace with his parents and accept his past. He reconciled with his youngest brother, Nicholas, who he had fallen out with years ago after Nicholas married a woman Louis didn't approve of. And once he came to terms with the fact that it was Johanna, not he, who was Carl's rightful parent, his heart began to soften towards her. When Johanna fell ill and unable to pay for her treatments, Louis sent money for medicines to her doctor anonymously. He wrote to her that he wished her all possible happiness and that he was very willing to help her. And when Louis was on his deathbed, it was Johanna who was at his side. Louis used normal patterns of behavior to ease his suffering, moving away from it, mastering it, and relying on method. These were good and brought him some relief. But now, at the end of his life, he began to find a different way, a truly original pattern that had the power to fully heal suffering, the one he learned from Jesus. Jesus doesn't ask for a fearful heart that runs away from suffering, but for a fearless heart that seeks the good. He said, "Come to me, all of you who are tired from carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." Jesus doesn't ask for a combative heart prepared to dominate suffering, but for a loving heart filled with compassion. He tells us, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer him the other cheek too. Jesus doesn't ask for a cool heart that relies on a method to get through suffering, but for a listening heart ready to hear the truth. He said, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do what my Father in heaven wants them to do. Jesus taught many times that the lasting response to suffering, the response that's truest to our nature, comes from our human heart. He tells us, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. But this has been said many times. The golden rule, do unto others what you would want them to do to you, is found as far back as ancient Egypt, over 2,000 years before Jesus. What's radical about Jesus' teaching is that he reveals love's ability to heal suffering. Jesus said, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. And to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. The way to heal suffering is found in his simple phrase, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Forgiveness doesn't run away. Forgiveness doesn't conquer. Forgiveness isn't a method. Forgiveness cures suffering because it shows where the root of our suffering is buried. When Peter said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus told him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. He's telling Peter that he'll suffer countless times. And when he suffers, forgiveness is how the heart heals. Forgiveness is our heart's truest response to pain, to hurting, to heartbreak. Forgiveness doesn't avoid, overpower, or manage suffering. Forgiveness meets suffering by awakening the love from which we're made. Without forgiveness, we'll pay no attention to our heart. Without forgiveness, our heart goes cold. Without forgiveness, we'll ask, why me? Why do I have to suffer this pain? Why am I being punished? What did I do to deserve this? Without forgiveness, these questions build a wall around our heart. Forgiveness is willing to live with imperfection, expects imperfection, and makes peace with imperfection, the imperfection in ourselves and in others. We're impatient to live in a better world where there'll be no more suffering. But if we find ourselves in this better world, it'll still be a changing world. And where there's change, there's loss. And where there's loss, there's sorrow. And where there's sorrow, there's suffering. We live with imperfection regardless of how much personal progress we make. Even if we were to attain perfect compassion, perfect charity, perfect humility, we'd still live in an imperfect world. We find perfection not in wanting to eliminate imperfection, but by forgiving imperfection and the suffering it brings. Perfection forgives imperfection, forgives our own imperfection, forgives our family's imperfection, forgives imperfection in our work, in our city, in our government, in all of creation. Our human heart knows at some deep level that life and imperfection can't be separated. Forgiveness doesn't skip out on or struggle against or stamp out imperfection. Forgiveness makes peace with our imperfection and those of others. This is radical. This is Christ consciousness. In his last years, Louis' suffering continued, but forgiveness changed the meaning of his suffering. Louis forgave his father, his sister-in-law, his nephew, and his brothers. He forgave himself his failure to have a love and a family of his own, and his agony over his imperfect hearing. And forgiveness is reflected in his music. Louis believed that his music expressed states of consciousness which could have been put across in other forms. He said that he's incited by ideas which are translated by the poet into words, and by me into tones that sound and roar about me until I set them down in notes. Music for Louis was first and foremost a form of self-expression, saying, what I have in my heart must come out. That's the reason I compose. As a rule, in his early works, Louis' music was presented as a conflict between musical ideas, like characters in a story. His compositions had two or more contrasting musical ideas that worked out their differences and came to a resolution. But as he matured musically and personally, he sees the power that forgiveness has to resolve conflicts, and his music tends to work with a single musical idea, a single character in a story that's portrayed as variations of that character, one who understands the changing moods and contradictions within himself. Rather than composing music that resolves conflicts between musical characters, his mature music reflects an attempt to reconcile the many facets of a single character's inner struggle, one between dark and light, between vice and virtue, between ego and soul, between defensiveness and forgiveness. To be willing to suffer in order to create is one thing. To accept that creation comes out of suffering is to admit that there's no conflict between achieving and suffering. Suffering isn't just a correction or a working out of cause-consequence. It's that, but it's so much more. Suffering is the fuel that powers our creativity, a fuel that gives life, that opens our heart to forgive and to love. Louis was sick and lonely and hurting, and he gave these miseries a shape which we can hear in his music. He took the broken pieces of a harsh and troubled life and turned them into music, into a thing of lasting beauty. His example shows that all of us can create something lasting and beautiful from our suffering. I want to leave you with a poem written by the Sufi mystic Rumi. I said, what about my eyes? He said, keep them on the road. I said, what about my passion? He said, keep it burning. I said, what about my heart? He said, tell me what you hold inside it. I said, pain and sorrow. He said, stay with it. The wound is the place where the light enters you. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, for a wonderful presentation and a great topic. I love the learning more about Beethoven, or things I was not familiar with. And I'd like to thank everyone who watched this live, and we thank all of you who have been following our weekly talks. Pardon me. We have some questions. Okay, this one is from Paula Craig. Is there any way we can tell the difference between suffering, like a debt we owe and must pay, or an experience we wanted to experience?
Oh, well, that would be pretty tricky to find out between the two. I mean, in the end, though, the way I see it is not the source of our suffering, because the source, as we know, the source of suffering varies so greatly between people. And one thing that's suffering for one person just rolls off another person's back. I think the important part here is how we respond to suffering. And you know, there's so many things hidden from our life, as we know, that our past lives are hidden from us. Many things. Even there's so much that happens unconsciously. So I would say I can't answer your question directly, because that's that's not information that I have. But I can ask you to think about how you respond to suffering, because there is really where the growth and the creativity and the love in our life is expressed.
I was thinking pretty much the same thing. So. Okay, next question. From the U.S. Spiritist Federation. Did suffering within his family enhance Beethoven's musical genius, or was he talented in spite of his upbringing?
Well, again, these are difficult questions, because you know, short of Beethoven telling us one way or the other, which he didn't, or some kind of psychoanalytical explanation that we could have, we wouldn't know. But the one interesting thing that I found as I was studying that, you know, think about this. I hope that you heard how difficult and painful a life he had when he was growing up. And he turned that into something great. He took this, it's like compost. He took the junk that we want to throw out in the garbage, the stuff that we wish didn't happen to us, and he was able to make it flower, to bring something really beautiful. So I would say it's very, you know, it seems likely to me that part of the passion that he had for music came from the fact that this was his refuge. This was the place where he could go and be fully himself. But he had talent from the beginning, even before his father's cruel treatment of him growing up. So it's a little bit of both, I would say.
Okay. Next question. How was Beethoven able to compose despite not being able to hear? Did his inability to hear change how he composed?
Well, for the first question, I have to admit I have the same wonder that he could. I mean, especially some of his music is so intricate and complex, and it's hard to believe that he could keep all of those things in his head all at once and not have to. I mean, he used the piano until the end of his life, because he wasn't fully deaf until he was around 50 years old, and so he had a piano. He said he'd feel the vibrations of the piano, and he would he would compose that way. So he did continue to use the piano, but much of his music was composed. He'd take really long walks. I mean, sometimes they said he'd walk for 6 or 7 hours around Vienna and have a little sketchbook with him, and he would just write down ideas. And again, uh, you know, even if you just step back for a minute, even thinking about reading music, most people look at a music manuscript and say, how can you read that? And yet my 3-year-old granddaughters are struggling to read just a word on a page. So a part of this is just a skill that you learn as you study music. You learn how to read music, and you read it just like you would pick up a book or a magazine or whatever you would read. So it was not unusual for people. I mean, Mozart was famous for this. He'd have the whole symphony in his head, and then he would just write it out. There was no piano involved, no nothing. So there is this this incredible ability, and you have to wonder how much help they got from the other side too in doing this kind of work, because to have that kind of focus. The second question, could you put it up again? Because I think I remembered it, but I wanted to make sure. Did his inability to hear change how he composed? I think most people who know about Beethoven would say yes.
Okay.
This was a way he built it was very clear he built a whole interior world of music. And because he had this idea, as I mentioned during the lecture, that he says, what's in my heart must come out. For him, music was a mode of self-expression, and it was his way to express himself. And so all of those things, when you listen to the music, you start to see what he was really trying to tell you. This is not music for entertainment only, as it was, say, in Mozart's day. Beethoven's music really is a form of self-expression, and casts a long shadow on every composer since him, since he died, or even during his life, because things could just never change after that. But yes, I would say for sure. Again, I can't tell you to what extent, but that he had this interior world that he created for himself, tells us that what he heard inside might not have been. I mean, he was one of his famous sayings. As you could tell, he was like a little edgy character. He wrote a piece of music, and they were a string quartet, and one of the string players said, you can't be serious about this. This is a joke, right? That you're playing on it. He says, I'm not writing music for you. I'm writing music for the future.
Okay. Obviously, he had no choice about not being able to hear, but it is amazing how a lot of artists will work within certain limitations, whether they impose the limitations or the limitations are imposed on them.
Yes.
Okay, next question. From Paul Jacoby. Edward, it sounds like Louis' incarnation was designed for him to experience through suffering, self-forgiveness first, and then for others. Is this a classic example of pre-life planning?
Well, I'm tempted to say more on the yes side of this question, because I can't answer it completely. But if you think of, this was almost a mission, you could say, that he not only overcame enormous difficulties in his life, but it has left, because a lot of us overcome difficulties in life, and we live and we die, and we're remembered perhaps from the people who surround us. But Beethoven affected not only music, but people's what they wanted to do with art. Because really before Beethoven, as I said, in Bach's time, Beethoven was for the glory of God. That was, and he would write in his manuscript, in the beginning of his manuscripts, for the glory of God. And all of his music, even his secular music, was done with that intention. by the time Mozart came along, music was kind of like a decoration, something a little, like an extra thing that you had that was pleasing and nice and entertaining and don't demand too much of it. And Beethoven came along, and he, of course, he worked within those ideas in the beginning of his life. But when he really started to, when his suffering really started, it started very early, but I mean, when he started losing his hearing, for example, that's usually the time when people see the break in the music that was written before. And it was about 30 years old. It was actually even younger than that when he started. But in his mid-20s, he started losing his hearing. But when it really started affecting him was when he was around 30, and he lived to 57. Okay. So, I would say definitely it looks very much, has all the earmarks of a mission, rather than, because, as I said, plenty of us work with suffering and have not left the impact and the effect that a Beethoven has on musicians and non-musicians alike.
And this is obvious, I assume, but he transformed classical music, right? I mean, his influence is enormous.
Yeah, it really, but I mean, there's music before Beethoven and music after Beethoven.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
really what it is. Mm-hmm. So the, and he died in 1826, 1827. And so, you think about all the composers that came after that, the Chopins and the Brahms and Schubert and Schumann. Well, Schubert lived during his lifetime. They all were alive during Beethoven's lifetime, but they were kids. And, all that music is made possible. That idea of self-expression, which we most of us think about when an artist sits down to create something, it's from the inside, and that came from Beethoven. That was his influence that created that whole idea that an artist expresses himself. Mozart didn't think about expressing.
He just did it. Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't his focus. It was probably in the mix there somewhere, but it wasn't the intention that he had.
That's fascinating. Okay, next question. This is from Yasko Arakawa. Hi, Mr. Christie. Great material. In the final account, as an immortal spirit, should we conclude Beethoven to be blessed and happy by his multiple afflictions in many areas and pass successfully the trials of that incarnation?
I would like to know that too.
Yes.
Everything that happens to us is kind of grist for our life. And again, to harken back to the answer to the first question that I gave, it really depends on what we do. And you can see that Beethoven, even though he had his moments, he had suicidal thoughts. There were times that he really didn't. I mean, there was never a time that he entirely stopped composing, but there are years when he would compose so little, it was almost as if he had composed nothing. But each time he was able to take his suffering and he pulled himself, he found something, some technique, some method to pull himself out of his suffering and really transform himself as a person. And as I said, it's beautiful when you see at the end of his life, all of these things that he did, like, leaving his family or saying, I'm a hero and I'm going to master my fate, or all those things, they're still there. And he's an edgy character. So he doesn't mellow out this whole day. Let's put it that way. He still has all that edginess, but he starts to introduce this idea into his writing and into his music, that forgiveness, this internal movement. I mean, he's struggling so much to tell you what's inside him. And because of that, he spends a lot of time in there. He spends a lot of time thinking about, how can I take this stuff that I've been given in life and do something really, really valuable with it. And I think that's what we're asked to do in every one of us, to take the circumstances of our life and say, this in some way is meant for my good. And what am I going to do with it? How am I going to do it so that it's creative and progressive and positive, even though we live with the suffering, as he did.
Right. Absolutely. Very, very good point. Okay. Another question from Mary Ramirez. Could it be that some of his music was channeled mediumistically?
Well, again, this is my opinion, but I think all music is channeled mediumistically. You know, I always, it's kind of funny because I was talking to someone once in a lecture, and we were talking about the influence of, you know, how much we're influenced by the spirits, and I was thinking, I said, well, you know, we're influenced by the TV, by magazines, by books we read, by people around us. And when I start to look at myself, I would say, I don't think I have one original idea. Everything that I think, everything that I know, everything that I believe, somehow has been transmitted to me. I didn't come up with this on my own. I mean, maybe I put my own coloration on it, as we all do, and there are things that I respond to better than other things, that, you know, because we're all here kind of, you know, for our own purposes in a kind of way. Oh, now I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Well, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead. You could probably complete it.
Okay. It reminds me of I think a comment Picasso made, where when he would start to do a painting, he said he would start the painting and then the painting would speak to me. That idea. So there was that exchange back and forth. So it really sounded like a connection from the other side.
So it's not just, you know, so the idea is we're always being influenced, whether it's from people who are living at the same time we're living, or spirits. We're always being influenced in some way. So even I mean, what you could talk about is percentage, perhaps, of influence. But there's no such thing as coming up with it on your own.
Right.
Because, you know, think about it. Every story heals us. That's why I wanted to tell Beethoven's story. When we hear the story of especially someone as notable as Beethoven, it helps. It creates a healing. So all the things that we have learned have not come up with someone sitting down in a chair thinking about these things. It happens in life. It happens from day to day. And then the sharing of those stories, the sharing of those experiences is really how all the things that we know now have come to us.
Yeah, and it's very much about encountering the unexpected and then figuring out what to do about it.
Exactly. You know? That's our job.
That's our job. Okay, from the U.S. Spiritist Federation, is it likely that Beethoven had committed suicide in prior incarnations?
Yeah, again, not a question that we would know the answer to, but it is kind of striking. I mean, like everyone, I've suffered my down periods, and you know, I've talked to other people, and they just say, no, I never considered suicide. I never thought about it. And so the fact that it was on his mind when he was at a really low point, you know, it didn't come from someone else, that idea. It probably came from, I mean, I know, for example, I'm afraid of heights. And actually, my fear of heights is not the fear of height. It's the fear of what I will do that high, what I'm capable of. And being up there, I can't trust myself anymore. So I think about that in the same kind of way. Those things come to me very clearly. You know, if I'm up high, I feel you can't trust yourself. You don't know what you're going to do. You could hurt yourself or someone else, or I don't know what, what it is. So I would say that's inside me. Comes from my past, and who knows what that was. But
Right.
if you're considering it, it's probably there in the mix somewhere, and there's a very good chance that even if it didn't turn out to be a successful suicide, sorry to call it that, but the fact that you would even consider it, is a pretty strong indication that the thoughts there in the mix and in your past.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. Next question. From International Spiritist Council. How much is suffering about learning to adapt?
Well, that was really my hope with this lecture, was that leaving and mastering and using methods are ways of adapting. And each one of them, they're all good. They're all so natural. And, you can't fault people for anyone. I've done it myself. Every one of us has done it. If something happens, you don't like this person, you find a way to get rid of them from your life somehow. Not get rid of them, but not to have them in your life anymore. I mean, these things are so natural, but they are adaptations. They are concessions in a kind of way. Like things are happening I don't like, so I'm going to adapt my life somehow by not having that person in my life, by not admitting that I'm a failure, or by by doing those. So the adaptation is again, it's understandable and it's human, but it only goes so far. It really does not, as I tried to bring out during the lecture, it did not, leaving his home didn't solve all his problems.
Mm-hmm. There's different,
mastering music and becoming a hero didn't solve his problems, because when he lost the love of his life, he went down. Those things can't sustain you. So, and the point was, what he realized was that true healing is the healing that Jesus tells us. The true healing of these things is not an adaptation. It's a change of heart. It's finding the love within us that allows us to forgive, the divine help that we get in order to forgive, because it's not really our place to forgive. It's our place to respond to forgiveness. Okay. And that's really what, because we could spend a lot of time justifying, well, this person doesn't deserve forgiveness, or I could never forgive that person. And that's all us. And we still have all those thoughts even when we hope to forgive someone. So that forgiveness really comes from all the help that we get.
Right.
Divine and otherwise.
So how we adapt is crucial. Not just adapting.
What I'm saying is adaptation is like a technique.
Mm-hmm.
So forgiveness is not an adaptation. Forgiveness is a true change within, a true discovery of the love that we're made from.
Okay. We have one more question, but I just wanted to ask you a very quick one, if I may. Was Beethoven very religious at all?
He was Catholic, and he wrote, yes, he was. At the end of his life, he wrote the great Missa Solemnis, the solemn mass. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you just have to listen to it to know that he meant it.
Okay.
He meant it. I never heard of him practicing it, but as you saw, he knew about Jesus and his teachings. He knew about Socrates. He knew about the Bible. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Last question. This is from Kevin Campbell. So grateful for this presentation. As a musician myself, I'm curious. Are there any further Buddhist principles that creatives like myself could find comforting in our upcoming sorrows?
Well, I mean, the Buddha spends his whole existence, it seems, talking about, the first thing he says is life is suffering. And if you read, I forgot, I don't have the 4 principles off the top of my head right now, but if you read that, I mean, his whole focus was, how are you going to deal with suffering? And so yeah, I mean, it's right there. It's not something you have to search for. You go to Wikipedia and you'll find the wisdom of the Buddha right there. And again, it all has to do with desire and wanting. That's really what it comes down to. We suffer because we want things we don't have, or we want to keep things that we lost, and it's all our desire. That's his. I think that's the theme that he keeps on reminding us of.
Mm-hmm.
We have to really ask ourselves, what do we want? And if what we want is something that can be lost, we're going to come into as someone said, we come into this world naked, and and we leave with nothing that we've got, nothing that we've possessed in this life. It puts it in perspective. Mm-hmm. and says, so every time we want to keep something, we're asking ourselves, we're creating pain, because at the end of our life we are going to lose it.
And Buddhism stresses that desire is a major source of suffering, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Edward. This has been wonderful and inspirational. And thank you, everyone who watched this live. And we thank all of you who have been following our weekly talks. Next Saturday, March 26 at 11 a.m., we have Leah Govera. And the theme will be Do Not Judge. Also, as a reminder, the United States Spiritist Federation has released a weekly virtual course called Initiation into Spiritism that is live every Sunday at 10 a.m. East Coast time. But afterwards, you can watch these courses whenever you wish. With extraordinary scope, this study will cover several relevant topics. It is based on the book Initiation into Spiritism, written by the renowned author Teresinha Oliveira, one of the major authorities in the field. Both beginners and those familiar with Spiritism will find this virtual course to be an excellent resource. Tomorrow's lesson will be the 9th in the series, and it is called Law of Cause and Effect, Free Will and Progress, certainly essential to Spiritism. For more information, please visit the U.S. Spiritist Federation's website at www.spiritist.us. And once again, thank you for supporting our efforts with a donation at our website or by scanning the QR code on screen. And now, before we end our live, I will do a prayer. So if you can, please close your eyes. We thank you, dear God, for all the ways in which we receive inspiration. We are thankful to have the gift of creativity. May each and every one of us be in harmony with creativity by being in harmony with our gifts. May we work with one another, be inspired by one another in the most positive ways possible. And may peace and serenity inspire all of us as we move forward through the journeys that we are on. Please bless this day. Please bless the era we are in. And may all of us have the wisdom to navigate it. Amen.